here to introduce Uzi Vishkin, who is the winner of this year's Parallel Computing Award. And one of the things that people here may or may not know is that so many of the fundamental things that we take for granted, and like this, everybody, we learned this in kindergarten, or we don't remember who developed it. Well, Uzi developed it. And I don't think there's anybody else that we can say that with so much of the foundations of our field, it came from Uzi Vishkin. And so I'm not going to do, all right, so Uzi's been a professor at Maryland since 1988. He's an ACM fellow, but there's all kinds of standard things that we talk about introducing people. But I think what I'd like to do, can you work? Yes, it works. But I think this is a really special circumstance. And what I'd like to do is actually read a couple of paragraphs from one of his many nomination letters that I think really capture why this is an extremely special case. Okay, so Uzi is being nominated for the SPAA Parallel Computing Award for significant contributions to the fundamental theory of parallel algorithms. More specifically, his work on developing a theory of parallel PRM algorithms and building on multi-core computer systems, successfully supporting the theory. In terms of theory, Uzi is arguably the most influential formative contributor to parallel algorithms literature. He introduced the now pervasive work depth methodology for parallel algorithms back in 1982. By the early 1990s, Uzi was arguably the top researcher in parallel algorithms. As highlighted in the nomination letter, tens of his fundamental algorithmic contributions are sufficiently foundational to be included in textbooks and surveys of parallel algorithms. Now, speaking personally, there were a whole bunch of different things that were listed that were formative for the letter writers. And then there were other things that were formative for me that weren't even listed. So even some of the major contributions for one person weren't even considered worthy on being on a list for other people because he's done so much. Okay, throughout then in the mid-1990s, most of the companies producing parallel machines went bankrupt, and the study of parallel algorithms, and the PRAM algorithm in particular, declined in popularity. Many universities stopped teaching parallel algorithms altogether. Through this time, Uzi ignored these prevailing sentiments and made it his personal mission to build a machine that can effectively support the PRAM. It took 2 decades of solid research, and Uzi has succeeded in his mission. By the way, that's another thing that I really appreciate is when there's a fad or a prevailing opinion of what the community should do. I think it's, I really appreciate when there's somebody who says, no, I don't believe this fad, and goes and does the opposite, which turns out, often to be correct. So I skipped a whole bunch of stuff, but I'm going to quote one more paragraph from a letter. One thing I find compelling is that Uzi himself has done both the theory and the practice for PRAM on chip. That is, he developed this wonderful theory of parallel thinking and then spent over 2 decades working out all the practical details, novel programming abstractions, compilers, runtime systems, and chip architecture, until the theory became a silicon reality. This was quite an impressive feat and well-deserving of the SPAA Parallel Computing Award. So I guess to conclude, let me see how to say this in the most strange way possible. Up until yesterday, or not, up until now, there's been a very large group of researchers who are part of the large group of not having won the SPAA Parallel Computing Award. And when we were, as a committee, we were looking at all the, people who haven't won the SPAA Parallel Computing Award. And it was so totally obvious that Uzi was the least deserving of being a member of this community. So, you're delighted to welcome Uzi to the stage.
Thank you, Michael, for this extremely kind introduction. I'm not sure I have much to add. Okay, so I will try to speak about general purpose parallelism, which means basically how to make parallelism the default form of computing, both as an ideal as in a target. An ideal means that even people who do not necessarily pursue making this a reality will look up to it, and be guided by it. So, let me see. Something funny. It is not changing on my screen. Okay. Okay. This is better. Okay, so since this talk is about an award, I'll make it a bit on the personal side. So a few things about what drove me as a young person. As an undergrad, I was sitting in this, I was a major in mathematics. I was sitting in class and heard about these amazing basic things that made it into textbooks. And I really was impressed and inspired by them. And I wondered what's going on. Are we studying what these people told us because they were born 300 years earlier when this field was developing? This was a coincidence, or were they really incredibly smart? And but then I was lucky as a master's student at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem to be guided by a co-founder of a field who happened 30 years later to get the Nobel Prize. And as a founder, I got a lot of inspiration from him on how to identify a field in its infancy and try to find your way around it. His field, by the way, was game theory and mathematical economics. So in 1979, where I was embarking on doing my PhD research at the Technion in Israel, it warmed me up to identify the infancy stage of parallel computing, and at that point ask a few strategic questions, because game theory is about strategy and stuff like that. So how to start? Should a researcher in this field at the infancy level start with how to build a parallel computer, which meant that because we didn't know how to program about it, how to think algorithmically about it, to build first and hope that we'll figure out later how to program it. Or to start with asking how people will think about parallel algorithms, and only then derive a system that meets the specs when it comes to algorithms and programming. But once I chose option B to pursue, the question was, how will the parallel textbook, the parallel algorithm textbook will look? So these were the guiding questions at the beginning. But again, what was important is to remember that we needed to build here some vertical integration, where algorithms and programming will not be enough. You will need the hardware to support it. So never forget that. So so here is a preview of my career from 30,000 feet. So the premise of this infancy stage around 1979 was my understanding that during my professional lifetime, perhaps the only core computing paradigm shift in core computing, as I said, will be from serial to parallel. And I said, wow, if this premise is correct, it's a great thing to invest my research effort in it. And in particular, my question was, if this is going to happen, how will general purpose computing survive the shift? Because everybody, of course, was doing serial programming. So how will it become the prevalent form of computing? These were the guiding questions. And the working assumption which I persisted with in pursuing this work was that parallel hardware must be designed for the simplest parallel programming possible. Otherwise, I observed that it will be pretty challenging, and otherwise we will hit a parallel programming wall where too many people will not be able to do it. So my work has here several big chapters. The mid-90s chapter was devoted to the question of how to think algorithmically in parallel. And there, the first big battle of coping with common wisdom was to cope with the theory focused at the time on the NC theory and work towards now, if I heard this session this morning, is the default form of thinking, which people in the room I'm not sure you can even appreciate that. Because what happened in the early 70s, there was this NP-completeness, fantastic accomplishment, right? So what did people do in the mid-70s? They did NP-complete reductions, and they thought about efficiency as polynomial time. So what was the analogy in parallel computing? What's called NC, polylogarithmic number of processors, polylogarithmic time, okay? So work efficiency, which was the dominant form in the session this morning, was completely out of the picture. Okay? So this was a very big battle, and I will tell you a few anecdotes about how it unfolded during the 80s. The work depth, uniform cost abstraction, which I will elaborate on again, which is taken for granted. It was used this term left and right this morning. Had to be invented basically, and of course the Piram algorithmic theory. What happened towards the end of this period? Remember, I'm not talking about the very important work that people continue to do on algorithms, but when it comes to understanding these basic notions of thinking algorithmically in parallel and so on, the work reached a certain level of maturity during the mid-90s, where it was time to shift towards the second part on architecture and how to build. So the basic mindset during this stage was, given a problem, develop an algorithm that provides as much parallelism for it as possible. Meaning, what you are negotiating is in the algorithm space. Then, mid-90s, it was time to take a 180-degree turn in mindset. And wow, I didn't see that it didn't move. I'm sorry. I probably didn't follow what I said here. Apologize. I don't know what. Something? I don't know what to do.
Exit and try again.
I'm sorry?
Exit out of PowerPoint and try again. just exit out of PowerPoint and try again.
Oh, come back. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, I did not. I did change that. So this was the slide I was talking about. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that it's not shifting. So the basic mindset. So I mentioned NC, moving from NC, countering the common wisdom of the community, moving from NC to work efficiency. I mentioned the work depth and the pyramid algorithmic theory, and I also mentioned the premise here of this will be the biggest paradigm shift during the many decades to follow. Okay, now it is changing. Good to see that. 180 degrees turn in mindset. What was the 180 degrees? Now you assume that the algorithm or the program are given. It's not negotiable. And your job as an architect is to minimize the hardware and software overheads to get the best performance out of whatever algorithm you are getting. Okay, so the algorithm design is out of the picture as a variable. So under this completely different mindset, I came up with this framework known as pyramid chip, which gave hardware and software support under the hood. In particular, I marked with red formative contributions. As part of this design, I came up with a memory architecture that supports integrated parallel CPU accelerator, which the integrated GPUs that you see today have pursued, followed up on. So you have it basically, I believe, on every desk as guided by that in billions of devices since the early 2010s. We did an FPGA prototyping, which is really commitment to silicon, which is scalable. We prototyped the power, and it came out pretty competitive with other platforms. And what was most fascinating is the challenge of developing a compiler, because the first generation of the hardware required a lot of sweat from graduate students, meaning to tune up the code to run on the hardware. But then the compiler people in the group, joined by a colleague at Maryland who is a compiler guy, guided them, looked over the shoulders of the programmers and automated. Next generation, it was better. You still needed to look over the shoulders of graduate students. And finally, we reached a pretty optimal compiler that allowed to program pyramid algorithm as is and have under the hood the translation into multi-threaded code that fits the hardware. Okay. So this was a 20 plus year effort, and I was recently named as a fellow of the National Academy of Inventors for the inventive side of it. Okay, what remains to be done? I believe that what remains to be done is to identify killer apps, because the prototyping of this approach is I believe, pretty complete when it comes to algorithms. So what remains to be done is to identify killer applications, meaning applications which will be heavy enough so that the people who give money will be happy to support building the hardware. Because the chicken and egg situation in which we are is the following. Nobody will fund hundreds of millions of dollars to build hardware before you have an application that they can cache. And nobody will develop an industry-grade application before they have the hardware. So there is a chicken and egg bind in which we are. I believe that it can be broken, and this has been focus of my work in the last few years, I believe that large language model inferencing offers an opportunity. Automated reasoning in the form of supporting, whose workhorse is SAT solving, which is a significant effort, a significant application can lead the way. And I will mention a few things later in connection with the announcement of the White House AI action plan announced last week. So I'll keep you in suspense about that a bit. Overall, you see now a rise in heterogeneous CPU accelerators, and when you see a bunch of heterogeneous accelerators different from one another, the question is, what is the horizon? Maybe the general purpose is where they'll be converging to. The success of GPUs is absolutely amazing, and they should be. What I want to point out is that in spite of their limited reach in applications, they had an amazing impact. So imagine what will be the impact of general purpose. So I think that the promise is out there, and the tentative mindset guiding that is really vertical. Well, you're not guided by algorithms or architecture alone. You need to come up with, starting from applications, algorithms, hardware, software, overheads, to get the best performance. So here, you need to negotiate everything. Okay, so this was the high-level introduction, and just to remind you something that I guess everybody in the room, especially from the parallel computing side, is familiar with. So a lead insight that started my work basically, and it was published in '82, but it was the topic of my early PhD thesis in '81, is that every serial algorithm can be thought of as a parallel one. And what I'm summarizing here in 30 seconds is a semester-long parallel algorithms course. So what is the basic abstraction behind serial algorithm? It is that a single instruction ready for execution can do it immediately. So you lay down the instructions here one at a time. My pointer, you see my pointer or not? No. Okay, so I probably needed a pointer. So I'm on the left side, the left figure there. So you lay one at a time, and then you assume that it takes unit time to execute. How can you think about it as a parallel algorithm? You ask yourself, when it comes to the operation time 2, can it overlap? Can it be done at the same time as operation number 1? Assume you have unlimited amount of parallelism. If yes, go ahead and do it. And then you go to operation time 3. Can you do it at the same time as the prior ones, if there is no dependence? Then go ahead and do it. First time you cannot do it, move to time 2 and then start piling up. Now, what is important is to understand that this requires cognitively, to ask the question, what could I do cognitively in parallel at each step, assuming a limited hardware. So for example, you are all familiar with breadth-first search. As we learn it in serial algorithms, depth-first search comes with an unpleasant constraint known as queues, first in, first out, right? What you need to do in this transition is to get rid of the queue. Just observe that natural breadth-first search advances from layer to layer. So this is a cognitive effort, but this cognitive effort, I believe, is a skill. Once you have the parallel algorithm, you don't need to invent. It's a matter of something I can teach you to do. You can be taught to do. So here, the challenge, of course, is to not increase the total number of operations called work, but rather cut the time relative to work. And the abstraction here is the assumption that now you can have a limited number of operations and they all can be done immediately. what I wanted you to take from that is that mathematical induction, inductive thinking of step by step, which guided serial computing, is still on. And this is a very important thing because mathematical induction is the main tool in mathematics to reason rigorously. And I believe, and I will make a point of it in a few slides, that the reliance of von Neumann on mathematical induction allowed the amazing growth of computing into many applications. So here we still rely on this basic mathematical reasoning. The rule of thumb that I try to follow is simplicity as a guide or an idea. In the paper with my thesis advisor, Yossi Shiloach at the Technion, which was the last chapter of my PhD, a paper on max flow, I believe that this was maybe the first the first efficient parallel algorithm for a truly non-trivial problem. It provided a role model for how to design parallel algorithms in the way that has become standard in this community. First, do a high-level work depth description, and later add details for making it a full theorem algorithm. Okay, this is where it was really demonstrated. And the subtle point here is that when it comes to theorem, you don't have a theorem that you will always succeed doing. Meaning you have a heuristic. Let's talk about work in an informal way. And only later add prefix sum routines, etc., to make it work on a theorem where you take all the overheads into account. So this type of a heuristic, where you can do it with work, W work and D depth, in W over P plus D time in a theorem, is not a theorem, but you can either do it or come very close to it when you go over many algorithms. The success of this framework was not obvious at all at the time. This heuristic amounts to, I believe, to what thinking parallel has come to mean in the field of parallel algorithms. My theorem work was guided by repeating, repeatedly seeking the simplest problem I don't know to solve and focus on that. This gave rise to a structured theory of parallel algorithms, and this surprised people at the time because it is a combinatorics related theory. And in combinatorics you have very little structure. It's unlike calculus or algebra. Parallel algorithms being perceived as coming of age, meaning the structure theory that came out. And the work depth as a framework and the structure theory already dominated early theorem textbooks. And to remind you, this was the type of structure that I published in a survey around 1990. Okay, so let me skip that. And then you had a bunch of early Piram textbooks that came out at that time. So this was a coming of age of the field. Now, one success of the notion of idea is whether people who think different than you may still be inspired by what you're doing. I claim that nearby schools of thought have been inspired by Piram work. For example, symmetry breaking techniques that came out of our work, like my work with Richard Cole I did in the mid-80s, notion of deterministic coin tossing, and Piram graph algorithms have influenced a lot of work in the POTS in the distributed computing community. And my guess is that it is probably, that the main reason is that the modeling of distributed computing is more involved. So when you work on a simpler model, you can see you can see further. Here is another anecdote from the high-performance computing world. Take the technique known as MapReduce. And I would like to share with you a nugget to show you how it actually emerged from Piram algorithms. So consider the following algorithm, which is the only algorithm I'm going into greater detail. Consider any integers on an array whose value is between 0 and square root of n. Okay, so you have any integer, you have an array of size n, you have n integers whose values are between 0 and square root of n. The problem I ask you to solve is that for each value between 0 and square root of n, find how many of the integers in the input are equal to it. I hope that the problem is well defined, right? So what is the algorithm? The algorithm is take the n integers, break them into square root of n groups, each of square root of n integers, meaning into subarrays. Now pick each of the subarrays and serially count for each of the integers how many of it exists. So this is a very serial algorithm, a very trivial serial algorithm done in parallel over the square root of n subarrays. Right? What is the walk? Walk is linear. What is the depth? Square root of n. Right? And now, once you figured out the plurality of each integer in each subarray, go and for each plurality sum up how much it is. Again, you can do it trivially in parallel. Right? And since we do everything here serially in parallel, again, the walk is linear and the time is square root of trivial. Okay, so here's an algorithm, and you know, to those of you who know a bit the literature, this was published essentially as an integer sorting algorithm, because we can also, you know, now with some prefix sum and stuff like that, figure out the sorting as well. But let's just look at that. Do you recognize this as the basic algorithm of MapReduce? I hope those of you who know this material should be able to immediately recognize. How was it published? So here is a really fun part. It was published as an integer sorting algorithm for n integers whose range is between 0 and log n. Not a very interesting problem. So what's going on here? Why was it published this way? The answer is because it was a kosher, it was a legitimate NC algorithm. Because you can convince yourself that under these considerations, what I just showed you can run in linear walk and logarithmic time. So, but why was it not published, as I just told you, as a linear walk and square root of n depth? The answer is that the dogma of the time, NC, would have rejected it. So how was the paper published? So this is a pretty important result. You know, gave back to MapReduce, sorting algorithm. It was published as a lemma in the list ranking. It was the only way to sneak it under the radar of the NC dogma. It didn't matter the work was linear. So the happy end is that first a group at MIT ran it on a craze at the end of the 80s. I believe that Guy and Charles were two authors of that effort. And then, of course, the MapReduce, which made it highly celebrated. but this term is no, the later part of the MapReduce was no credit. Simplicity is a guide or idea. What we managed to do is to achieve here the capstone where the programmer job is done with the immediate concurrent execution, you know, that you can do all this operation in constant time, subject to this assumption, and in a way which means that the work depth abstraction is everything that the programmer needs to provide. Beyond that, it can be done under the hood using compilers. So that's what we prototype. And in that respect, what you see here is a connection with this famous Albert Einstein statement that everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler, meaning you still need to have a cognitive recognition of parallelism, but not more than that. An old colleague who has known me said that once we achieve this capstone, you know, of doing that I can retire now, because he knew that that's sort of my technical mission for decades. I'm not going to go too much in detail into this slide, but the Piram XLT framework basically is single-threaded in the sense that, you know, you still do things in a semi-serial way, exposing the concurrent execution of things of operation every step. But the reliance was on the large latent knowledge base of Piram algorithms, which were the easiest form of parallel algorithms out there. Emphasis on low work. Polylogarithmic depth was not necessary. The serial mode had to be competitive with the best serial CPU, because and then that every serial algorithm is a parallel algorithm. And this was a very important thing. The main reason for parallel computing is to speed up serial computing. If it doesn't do that, it's not good. So it's important to remember that serial computing has been around, has been very successful, and the only justification of parallel computing is if it can do that. Some of the inventions included low overheads for transition between serial mode and parallel, acceleration, low overheads for low balancing, dynamically changing parallelism, low latency, high bandwidth interconnection networks. Patents included the control side, memory, data, interconnection networks, and more. No system-imposed cache coherence, which saved a lot of overheads. For those of you who know what it is from architecture. Competitive power consumption, especially on irregular parallel workloads, and the commitment to silicon I already mentioned. And the capstone feature is that it can be programmed effectively with as-is Piram algorithm, and this needed several generations of compiler optimization, a point I already made. And something I'm particularly proud of is that there is a high school in the metropolitan area of Washington, in Alexandria, Virginia, in which well over 1,000 students have been programmed over the last 10 plus years. And now this material, this Piram algorithm, is taught as part of the AP class. You know, at the end of the AP class, we still have a couple of months, so they teach that there now. Okay. Not just talking. This is the summary of the architecture we built. The vertical integration you see here, algorithms, way of thinking, the programming, compiler side, and then this is the FPGA we built, and even we tried our hands at some silicon. Why is general purpose still a good idea? Say in the form of a manifold. So first thing, this is now about more about perspective. I want to remind you a term which was very popular 25 years ago, and it was coined by Andy Grove, who was the legendary CEO of Intel. He called it software spiral. And what did he mean by that? He meant that by the end of the 80s, already you had billions of dollars invested in software that ran on the Intel chips at the time, that were basic serial CPUs. And then he explained his business, the Intel business model, using this term, which means that in every generation you keep supporting the same application software, and the hardware keeps running it faster. So people continue investing in upgrading the software, and the hardware continues supporting it. But it's the same software. The point is that application software people are willing to invest because they know that the application software will not run on just one generation, but on many. Okay. Now, the point is that for parallelism, it's crucial to continue to provide such a support, and I believe the general purpose computing, as I understand it, should be able to do that. But the understanding among the multi-core community that they can deliver that has hit a wall. And here is a quote of Pat Gelsinger, who was the former CEO of Intel. They believe that they can do it, but it ended up not working. I believe that our approach can deliver that. The next thing I wanted to say is something that is taken for granted. I claim that there is some miracle side to the success of computer science that we take for granted, and I will try to explain what it is. If you look at papers written by von Neumann, who started the von Neumann architecture around the early 50s, you see that the framework was driven by very few algorithms, had some numerical analysis type algorithms, and an understanding of mathematical induction as a quintessential primitive for rigorous reason. And what is the von Neumann architecture? It's a bridge between serial programs and algorithms and the stored program serial architecture. Okay, they saw, he and Goldstein, who's main collaborator, saw the need for increasing memory. But what they didn't see at all is 99.9% of the applications of computing that we are aware of today. So think about what's going on here. These people were able to design something, engineering, for serendipity. To those of you who are not familiar with the term serendipity, is to do something that something good comes out of it without any plan. This is ingenious. How did he deliver that? Because he relied on mathematical induction, knowing that that's a rigorous tool of thinking. That's my speaking. So I think that what we need is to rejuvenate that, and general purpose parallel computing can do that. And in such a way that application programming is mastered by common programmers, and we provide backwards compatibility. I claim that the opening now with the new White House announcement entitled "Winning the Race," this is a political statement, American AI Action Plan, announced last week. It has one interesting term there, in my opinion, that attracted my attention. They define AI as a general purpose technology. But I claim that this is a pretty loaded term that actually opens up an opportunity even for us in parallel computing. Why do I say that? What does it mean that it is general purpose? It means that it should produce correct AI codes from specs, right? People are using it now to enhance programming, right? So we give specs, AI gives them code. What do they do today? They have humans verify the code, which is ridiculous, right? Because you miss the whole automation part, right? But you would like to verify the correctness automatically, which is a standard, by the way, for hardware design, for example, or for computer security applications, as used by companies such as Microsoft and Amazon. For that, you need to harness, that's the only trick in town, SAT solvers, which is the verification workhorse, and do so effectively. Okay, if you agree with these statements, which I believe are part of the assumption that AI is a general purpose tool, then current commercial parallel platforms such as GPUs and NPUs are not going to deliver. Because if you take a close look at SAT solvers, you see how irregular they are, how little parallelism they sometimes have, and how completely unstructured and unpredictable and heavily nested it is. Okay, so just a short advertisement. The first talk on Friday will say a few things about it by a team, by a student and us at Maryland. Engineering AI for serendipity demands more broadly effective computer technology, and this will be a major step, I believe, towards general purpose parallelism. So I think that what happened here for the GPU NPU world is that they created a certain amazing progress that in order to go to the next step, they may not be strong enough. At this point clearly. So I think that this is really exciting. Because I view it as an agentic system. You know, where you will have an agent who will take your output of a proposed program and automatically will test, will verify. And if it fails, it will go back and try to produce another round and another round. So you can see here how agentic AI can basically incorporate it and make it take it to the next level and make it a pretty powerful application. Okay, I don't know, we started a bit late. How much time do I have, if any?
Let's see. All right, great. So it goes until 12:15 until Q&A, and a little bit later is also okay.
Okay, so I'll go a bit further. Okay, thank you. So I had an interesting debate with an amazingly successful colleague, Bill Daly, who is the chief scientist and senior vice president at NVIDIA, also a professor at Stanford, a point-counterpoint debate that was published at the Communication of the ACM almost 3 years ago. And the topic was on model of computation. And what Bill Daly argued was that data movement is of prime importance. And because it is the primary consumer of power. So he perceives it as a power war. Meaning, if you move data, you consume too much power. Valid point. My counterpoint was that for a limited extra power, and we published on that, and interestingly enough, the ex-student who published the work on why XMT requires limited extra power, worked for 10 years for Intel and now works for NVIDIA. It's So it gives some support to the credibility of his work. So for limited extra power, we can get easy programming. Otherwise, I claim that you run into a parallel programming world, and which will mean that we will fail the engineering for serendipity test. Because if it's too difficult to program, how can you expect your next application to be successfully programmed? Okay, so you have here the two beliefs, right? I believe that both points are legitimate. Power is an objective thing, but human capability and productivity are also a constraint. So, choose your pick. One other debate here is that there are two ways of looking at matrix multiplication. One way is think about it as an algorithm, which is how parallel algorithm programming should be, which is actually challenging because then you expect the programmer to program for locality and limited data movement and so on. So is this the role model for that? The other opinion, which I tend to favor, is that this is an example where an optimizing compiler can do the trick. It's not how your next algorithm should be. It's a one-time thing that after algorithm guys observed it, you don't need any more human creativity to do it. Okay, so parallel algorithms in contrast to that should be easy. Okay, so you see why you have legitimate debates here, which I believe as the field keeps growing, they are going to unfold and guide much of the activity we see. I was talking about general purpose parallelism as an idea. So I would like to demonstrate to you why there are some similarities here. I already mentioned the impact of nearby communities. But if you think about really enormous research ideas that we have seen over the last more than half a century, almost 70 years, 60, 70 years, what did we see? We saw the human genome idea. What was the goal? To sequence the human genome in order to learn how genes control inheritable functions of the body. Okay. Beyond scope of that project was what's known as epigenetics. What is epigenetics? Epigenetics is the study of inheritable changes of interchanges of organisms caused by modification of gene expression rather than the genes themselves. What's the connection between the two? The connection between the two is only because of the genome project. The second thing was developed. Meaning it was beyond scope. Sometimes you have an idea which is so powerful that the broad impact that it brings exceeds the original goal. The moonshot of the 1960s, landing a person on the moon, had this amazing broad scope of advancing material science, automation, robotics, computer systems. All of them were beyond the space exploration. Each of these, Now, the broad impact of algorithmic sync parallel and the quest for general purpose parallelism. So, the broad use of work depth theorem as a first step in developing algorithms by nearby schools of thought. So, various forms of coarse grained parallel and distributed algorithms, both in high performance computing, GPUs, and distributed computing. The broad use of pyramid techniques. And one of the most fascinating things is the strawman fallacy to suggest alternatives. Algorithmic and programming models with extra constraints on synchrony, communication, interconnection networks, and queuing. There is a famous 93 paper from Berkeley claimed that pyramids are realistic, which got me into the ambition of actually showing that it can be done. But even in the Hennessy Patterson last textbook version, last edition, they wrote, unlikely the simple multi-core scaling will provide cost-effective paths to growing performance. So what is so fascinating about all this development is that sometimes a strawman fallacy can itself be fallacy, because we show that we can actually do that. But when people try to challenge you because you come up with a pretty ambitious goal, sometimes the effect of entering a debate and having other ideas, sometimes is pretty significant. So I think that this has been the part of the journey here, of the idea of general purpose parallelism, the broad impact that it has. So perhaps like the North Star, it has been used for navigation regardless of whether approaching or distancing. Okay, so this is my last slide. I wanted to thank all my co-authors and colleagues riding along who challenged me also. Thanks for the SPAA for this wonderful award. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me, as I hope I explained, because it really touches on the core of my work, which I try to share with you. So keep up the good work towards further advancing the general purpose computing idea.
So questions?
So you mentioned, some of us.
Same time, so
Oh.
Very good.
Okay. So you've done a huge amount of work on specific parallel algorithms, and you didn't mention them except a few in passing. Maybe list rank popped up there, and but there's many famous algorithms that you're responsible for. Do you have a favorite among all of them?
Yeah. So
Who's your favorite?
just. I think that there was one slide, which actually showed some of this work. So I think in a way I feel that the original Max Flow, I anticipated the work depth as a heuristic. It's still my favorite in many ways, because it was strategic. It actually showed the direction, and some of the satisfaction I got from listening to the session this morning is, it created a language which countered what all the leaders of the complexity community argued when I started doing the work. It actually, the NC stuff and all of that. And this created a language that, in a way, is much more powerful than a specific algorithm. But of course, each one of them is sort of my child, so I like each of them for whatever they are. But you wanted me to name one. Thanks for the question.
So you mentioned stat solvers for verifying program correctness, but in the flavor of all this, what about program efficiency? Have you thought about, do we need to somehow teach these agentic systems, AI systems, to understand asymptotic complexity and work depth models and things like that?
You want them to analyze it for you?
I want them to write fast code. I don't correct it
Oh,
enough,
no,
right?
of course, no. So
And asymptotically, it's
right,
getting
writing. Okay. So I think it's the way I understand it is that you first want them to write programs that probably the AI guys, to the extent that they will succeed, will first write good serial algorithms, efficient ones, and of course later I definitely expect them to do good parallel code. I think that that's a natural thing to happen. Absolutely.
And it won't be solved by matrix multiplication, right? So it's another.
I think matrix multiplication has this overhead. So the challenge, yeah, matrix multiplication is not as efficient for many as we know. Otherwise, we would have used in this community matrix multiplication for every problem. But, yeah, efficiency will be definitely part of the roadmap for AI. Not only writing correct code, but writing correct, efficient and correct. But yeah, this is absolutely. I believe that what they can do today, if you can ask, from my limited experience with generative pre-trained transformers, is that the GPT approach is that you can get comparisons for many codes, and then they should be able to probably reason about the complexity of the efficiency. Because you can already get alternatives, right? You can ask, give me alternative codes for doing this. So I expect the agentic AI will be able to take us there. I don't know. I'm not an expert in this space. So my 2 cents also.
Yeah, I just think it supports your general notion that the world isn't reduced to matrix multiplication, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that the challenges here are, I think that we have an opportunity to break the chicken and egg bind of applications by actually riding on the current success of AI. Because the more you push the current platforms towards more and more applications, you try to imagine where it can go, you are likely to hit applications where they will not be good enough or efficient enough. So one of the biggest challenge, which I myself underappreciated, is to find killer apps. Killer apps is an amazingly challenging thing. Applications that are not yet there, that will require a new type of computer system. It's very difficult to actually reason about it because it lies at the intersection of business, technology, engineering, many things, economics. So imagining an industry-grade application that will be valuable monetarily is a much greater challenge than I ever anticipated.
I'll ask another one if nobody else has one. Sure. So one thing that you haven't highlighted, but you could have, is that so the work depth analysis, there is a big, there's always been a big pushback from other communities that you're never going to have enough processors that you really need polylogarithmic depth. Right? Basically, polynomial depth ought to be good enough for pretty much anything. Whereas in this community, spirited by your work, we've always tried to sort of get the best of both worlds: the NC world with the polylogarithmic depth, and but adding the work efficiency, right? But over the years, this community and others have shown that the depth of an algorithm comes to play in very important ways in other computational model settings. Like if you start to analyze cache analysis, number of cache misses, something's going to take, I'd say under a work stealing set or something. The depth of the graph dictates like how many steals you can have. It also dictates cache performance. If you look at external memory models, I/O models, sort of the number of I/O rounds you need is often the depth. So things that end up being extremely practical care about shrinking the depth beyond just, a square root of n or n to 2/3 or something like that. So I think that is another powerful outcome of sort of trying to get the depth down while getting.
I completely agree. I think that the fundamental nature of work and depth is such that when you look at real application, you trade them for various shortcomings or constraints. So really, the slackness, for example, of parallel algorithms, like, if you have a delay in your network that implements parallel algorithms, what do? The pipeline. What does it mean that you pipeline? That you take some of your parallelism and you don't take it directly to the bank, but instead, if you have a pipeline of 10, you decrease your speed up by a factor of 10. But if you have an extra 1,000, you still have 100 to spare. Okay, so that's what makes it so fundamental. So I completely share your sentiment on that. That there is something really fundamental about these measurements that when you do the theory part, you sometimes may not anticipate how it will be used when it's reduced to practice. So I think that's part of a proof. I agree with you that this is another good example of something which is beyond scope in a sense, beyond your original scope. And that's one of the advantages of doing fundamental work. That you never know how it will be actually used, because if you ask the basic questions.
I'm spending some time trying to formulate my question. Hopefully I can say it in a way that makes sense. At the beginning of the talk, you laid out that in your broad research agenda, you had the A and the B, right? That one of them was targeted towards developing a sound mathematical theory, with depth model, etc., to create, think about parallelism and parallel algorithms. The second part was towards actually bringing this to practical fruition through architectures and frameworks that can take algorithms and make them fast and so forth. You laid out a big open problem on the second side, right? A killer app or killer apps in this field. Do you see there as being any big open problems on the theoretical mathematical side of things that still happen?
In the traditional algorithmic sense, I'm not sure I see something in isolation of the rest. I think that I'm sorry, I will disappoint you. I think that the next big thing could be the killer app. I really feel that, and I think that maybe that some of the answer to your question will relate on how you can use the competence or capability of this type of a community in order to harness some of the development in AI and create this hopefully killer app application. And I try to actually allude to them in a very concrete way through the verification. Because the verification actually exposes here something that none of the accelerators that are developed currently by the industry or the system community is at all addressing. And you see it from the algorithmic side, if you try to let your imagination go. And that if you think about it, this is a huge hole in their perspective that actually, interestingly enough, the White House exposed by saying, we want general purpose AI. General purpose will require capabilities that exceed what they do. So interestingly enough, when you try to build the scientific political side to things, which is driven also by the business world, you expose opportunities. And I think that this agentic AI and so on creates wonderful opportunities, and I encourage everybody here to keep their eyes open and look for that, because I think that this can have a very high impact, and we bring special strengths to the table that maybe other communities do not. And of course, the name of the game always is to capitalize on your strengths. But you need to keep your eyes open. I think that in a way, when I started by reflecting on my ability or my lack to understand that parallel computing is going to be a big deal. And I believe that here there is some infancy, very dynamic infancy. Much greater infancy is going on in front of our eyes as we speak, at a much higher rate than I recall during the previous decade. So it's pretty amazing. But I think you need an open mind here, and I think that it's an intellectual challenge of a different kind. I just encourage everybody here to think about it. Go ahead.
You mentioned starting out developing parallel thinking and then transition to actually building the hardware. In quantum computing, how would you say this balance is played out, and what do you think about it?
I cannot really. I think that okay, first let me qualify my expertise. I don't make any claims there. I think that in quantum computing, the technology is the tricky part. Here, I think that the applications are tricky part. So I think it's a different level of maturity, as I understand it. Because my understanding of quantum computing is that it requires engineering at such a miniature level, which creates a tremendous amount of noise. And I'm not saying that eventually people will not be able to resolve it, but I think that this is as far as I can tell, that's the big unknown there, at least when it comes to the next decade. That's my 2 cents worth. I can be easily corrected. Go ahead.
I'm curious, over the course of your career, how parallel architectures have matched your expectations, or what developments surprised you? And maybe bonus question, like, were there any directions for parallel architectures that seemed promising but didn't pan out that you still kind of look back favorably on?
Yeah, so for example, I mentioned the integrated GPU, because there you really have this basic idea. So I didn't elaborate on my XMP architecture, but basically the way it works is that you have a CPU and you have a larger number, a scalable number of processors, and it works like, I like to imagine it to a conductor of an orchestra. Just imagine, in an orchestra where you have sometimes a conductor, a pianist. So they play solo, and then they activate the orchestra, and then they take back control, and so on. So that's really the framework I had in mind. And if you think about the integrated GPU and their memory organization, it's basically guided by, I believe, by my thinking. Where they didn't deliver my vision is on the flexibility of the integrated GPU. It's more constrained. So I anticipate it to be more flexible. So this actually answers in part at least your question. I believe that making it more flexible is what we did in our prototyping. And I believe that the challenge I articulated of verification actually enforces a need for it, as an example, but that's not more than a single example. So, thank you.
All right, I guess we should conclude for lunch, but first one last